when can kids start? Like when should parents make it fun? Like do some push-ups with me, do some pull-ups. When is it okay for kids to start? And could we be setting up kids or young adults for better success in life if we give them a memory of the muscles, if it's possible?
It's absolutely possible. And you did what I would suggest anybody doing. You say that you started later, but you started at a time where you still had a ton of potential and you were still growing. And that is why you're able to maintain the physique that you have. And you're still very active to this day and continue to be active. When I wrote my book, that was the most surprising aspect of the book. And I have a section on children. The common thinking is that children shouldn't train and that children should not train with weights. There's actually no evidence to support that. And in fact, the guideline recommendation is to include some kind of resistance training. And it can be at any age. My 2.5-year-old lifts little weights. And again, Leonidas is not doing a 1 rep max deadlift, but we are so concerned about all this other stuff, childhood obesity and being in front of the iPad, but it seems as if the overarching conversation that mirrors that is this idea of, well, don't start too early exercising. Those kids should not start early training. And that actually is totally untrue. And in fact, it's recommended that they do have structured activity as early as possible.
And it's just, my sister has a room in her house. It's kind of just a playroom. And so they have a soft floor and they have cushions that come with this gym, but it's just monkey bars and a few ropes and they swing on it and they climb this little net. And I just think like, that's so cool that they're using body weight to move. And I really hope that it's going to help them. But I think that they're doing weightlifting without knowing it because kids just want to play. I guess it's the beauty of playgrounds. The cool thing about the indoor playground is they can use it all year round. You can help set your children up for success by encouraging them to do some sort of resistance training as early in life as they're interested in doing it. If they see you doing it, they can do it with you. And for me, I again, it's a very interesting thing that I wonder about. Like, I don't think anybody pushed me to do it. I just wanted to look better. And so I went to this local gym. Later in life, if you didn't lift weights in your teenage years, can we also pattern muscle and give the muscle some sort of memory? Because ultimately, like we're talking about, what we want is to have a healthy amount of skeletal muscle. And that's a relative term, but most people are probably under muscled. That's to borrow your term. And so do you think that for most people, especially if they're under muscled, like this resistance training is really a requirement? You need to really give your muscles that signal. And that can improve, like we said, immune system, brain function, and also metabolism, which helps people lose weight.
It's a non-negotiable. And I was looking at some of the data, and these are 89-year-old individuals able to still gain strength and mass.
Wow.
Which is incredible. That is how plastic this tissue is. One of the other things that happens if you are sedentary is the tissue that you want your skeletal muscle to be like is a fillet. And over time, again, I'm a geriatrician by training. And when you look at images, whether it's CT or MRI, you can see fat infiltrate into the tissue over time. That, depending on where you are in that continuum, can be changed. You can reverse it. There are things that you can do. And again, it's never too late. You do need to do some resistance training. Will cardiovascular activity help in some regard? It will, but really, it's not just about the health of the mitochondria. It really is about hypertrophy and strength. Both of those things become critical. And the more muscle you have, the more healthy muscle you have, the more mitochondria that you have. Let's think about skeletal muscle as an organ system. It makes up 40% of the body weight. Imagine if that becomes pathological. If that tissue has pathology, just by sheer mass, the impact it's going to have. Conversely, if we keep it healthy, then imagine the long-term effects as it relates to aging and overall health and wellness. Contracting skeletal muscle releases glutamine. This was really some of the earlier research that connected the immune system and exercise. Contracting skeletal muscle releasing glutamine, which is a semi-essential amino acid, is an energy source for lymphocytes, cells of the immune system. Incredible. There are incredible ways to leverage skeletal muscle and reframing the narrative away from being jacked and tan to true, I mean, jacked and tan, having good hair, to truly shifting the conversation from a medical perspective. One has to understand that maintenance will only get you so far. It becomes more difficult to build muscle as you age, depending on how you live your life. And the reason that is because hormones decline. If an individual is not on hormone replacement, there is just a natural decline. It's also thought that skeletal muscle, which is a nutrient sensing organ, becomes increasingly insulin resistant. Is that true that skeletal muscle, because of age, becomes insulin resistant, or is it really due to lack of activity? It is probably more due to lack of activity. That being said, understanding that it does become easier to build muscle earlier on. And there's things that change. For example, capillary perfusion and splanchnic extraction for nutrients for amino acids. Your original question is, how much is the minimum and how much would be the maximum? This is highly dependent. One way to think about it is thinking about what is the ultimate goal. Should people do cardiovascular activity? When I break it down, I think about, as nerdy as this might be, somewhat of the fiber types. I might think of slow twitch and fast twitch muscles, just again, because I'm a geriatrician by training and I had to do those early morning biopsies, which I feel bad for myself still many years later. And slow twitch type 1 fibers, you think about endurance activity. You think about high mitochondrial density, all of which is important. We've seen that over time, if you are inactive, one of the hallmarks of aging is a decrease in mitochondrial function. Therefore, doing some kind of stimulation of zone 2 training can potentially be beneficial. This tissue seems to be much easier to maintain as we age versus the fast twitch type fibers or type 2 fibers. These are the low mitochondrial density fibers. They have more glycogen, and this is where glucose goes. This is the main place for glucose disposal, which really is skeletal muscle. These fibers seem to be more challenged. And oftentimes we see an individual who's aging like your parents. They probably were buffer when they were younger. And that may be because they didn't keep up with their training, or again, were they active enough? Did they have enough dietary protein? All questionable. But it seems that making sure the minimum effective dose, in my mind, for muscle maintenance is about 10 sets per muscle group per week. Each training modality seems to have a different metabolic stimulus. Could you get the same benefit? Could your 71-year-old mom get the same muscle hypertrophy benefit if she was lifting lighter weights, more reps? The data would suggest yes. The question becomes, what about the molecular signaling? So it is different. There's a potential that the molecular signaling is different from heavier weights versus lighter weights. There's a lot of things to consider, especially when we're thinking about functionality. So to round out the question, 10 sets per exercise, it could be high weight, it could be lower weight. But probably if it were my parent, my dad who lives in Ecuador, I suggest that he lifts heavier and also adds in rotation, because we're not training to be in the gym. We're not training to become better at exercise. We're training to become more effective and efficient at life and have more capacity and to be as healthy and as sturdy and as resilient as we can. And that involves doing actual movements, like doing a farmer's carry, like doing things that are meaningful, like being able to squat down, do a deadlift, pick something up, put it overhead. Yeah. So myokines, the science behind myokines is relatively new. I would say it's been for the last 23 years. There's hundreds of different myokines. I think that they've categorized around 60. The most famous is interleukin 6, and interleukin 6, which we are very familiar with when it is released from macrophages in what we would consider a cytokine storm. The skeletal muscle releases interleukin 6 depending on the duration and intensity of training. And it releases myokines, but the interleukin 6 has a different effect on the body, a different effect than the myokines that are released from macrophages. It dampens the immune system. It creates somewhat of an anti-inflammatory counterbalancing impact, which is incredible to think that one of the reasons why a sedentary lifestyle may be so dangerous is not just the health of skeletal muscle, because it's that decreased glycogen flux that can create a lot of reactive oxygen species and intracellular lipids. You have to train the tissue to generate that flux. But the other underappreciated aspect of skeletal muscle is that contracting component, that contractile component that releases these myokines. When you do not release these myokines, then you do not impact the immune system in the same way. It also has an effect on lipolysis. It also has an effect on glucose regulation, not just the contracting skeletal muscle utilizing energy and ATP, mitochondria, but again, just the actual homeostatic mechanism. And that's just one myokine. There's also BDNF, which we've heard of, capsaicin B. There's just a whole host. There's a myokine that can affect tumor regulation, decorin.
All kinds of things released from the muscle. Is it known? I suppose it might be a different threshold for different myokines, but when I don't move enough, if I'm traveling and I'm sitting on a plane, I recently went to Australia. It's a 15-hour flight. I can just feel that my brain is not as healthy and my outlook on the world is not as good, presumably related to BDNF or other neurologic mediators for my brain. And I imagine that was related to just this dearth of myokines because I just wasn't moving because I was so sick. So is it known how much we need to move to get these myokines to be stimulated?
What we can do is that we can focus on muscle health. If you target muscle health, then the subsequent release of the myokines, one could conclude, would be adequate. And it doesn't take much to maintain skeletal muscle health. I mean, some of the earlier studies that I worked on out of Lehman's lab, they were doing 30 minutes of walking 5 days a week and 2 days a week of some kind of yoga as resistance training. And that was very minimal. And that was enough to maintain lean body composition. My guess is that will probably be the minimum effective dose. And again, there's a whole body of literature looking at the different myokines, but we're not in a place yet where we can measure them because it's just so volatile. Interleukin 6 is could you measure it? You can absolutely measure it, but it is volatile.
I'm going to conclude that nutty pudding, green smoothies, and caloric restriction with over 100 pills a day is how I achieve longevity. So I appreciate your divergent perspective.
Well, first of all, that sounds like an exhaustive plan. That many supplements and that kind of food just, number one, sounds exhaustive. And number two, just doesn't sound pleasurable to eat. Skeletal muscle is the organ of longevity. And I think that is becoming much more mainstream in the concept that skeletal muscle is an endocrine organ. Above and beyond being fit, it truly is our metabolic sink. It is our body armor. It interfaces with the immune system. It's an endocrine organ. You name it, skeletal muscle interfaces with the result of many of the metabolic diseases that we're, quote, facing now, like diabetes, obesity, you name it, metabolic syndrome. You know, oftentimes the individuals are talking about it as if it's something out there. It's obesity is the cause. Obesity is just a result. Obviously, it is complex in the cause, and there can be many things that are going on, and same with insulin resistance. But at the end of the day, there's only one organ that we can do anything about, and that's skeletal muscle. And the data also supports that the more healthy skeletal muscle mass you have, the greater your survivability against disease. It's not if, it's when something is going to happen.
I never really thought about it that way, but it's a good point. I guess if I do some amount of cardiovascular activity, I can sort of improve my heart, but muscle, you can really affect this organ with what you do in your life. By doing resistance training, by doing the things in our lives, we massively, or even nutrition, which we'll talk about, both of those things. It's not like I can really do that with my liver, although I think there are things we could do to support our livers, but it's not like I can increase the size of my brain necessarily by, I guess maybe in some ways there are parallels, but muscle is like very visible, you know? You do these things and you can change the amount of muscle and how well it functions. That's really interesting.
And not only that, you have cognitive control over it. It's something that skeletal muscle, you have voluntary control over. You cannot think of your liver and make it bigger. I mean, maybe you could exercise it by drinking, but the reality is you couldn't think your heart or your brain bigger. But skeletal muscle, when you create a plan and really focus as it relates to longevity, you have an exponential gold mine of something that you can improve upon. And again, when we talk about health outcomes, you have to be able to execute off of something that is going to create an outcome. And the outcome is clear with skeletal muscle. The outcome is clear, and it's something that you can absolutely gain tissue no matter what your age. You can gain both strength and actual skeletal muscle tissue no matter how old you are.